General Motors didn't just close a plant. It walked away from a $1 billion promise. And tonight, that decision is coming back at a cost the company never expected. Because when GM shut down the CAMI EV facility in Ingersoll, cutting 1,200 Canadian workers loose and leaving a town of 14,000 on economic life support, it wasn't simply a business adjustment. It was a breach of trust, a breach worth more than 3.2 billion Canadian dollars in public support over the past decade, including $1 billion poured directly into the BrightDrop conversion. And now, with the company retreating to Detroit as if nothing happened, Canada has decided it's not letting this episode slide into the background. Not this time. Here's the hard truth. GM believed it could exit Canada without consequences. It believed workers would absorb the shock, communities would cope, and Ottawa would issue a polite statement before moving on. That was the pattern for years. That was the expectation. And that miscalculation is exactly why the next 72 hours stunned Detroit more than any tariff threat in recent memory. Because 3 days after the shutdown, the Canadian government executed a counter-move that hit the U.S. auto industry with the precision of a guided strike. No warning, no negotiation, no diplomatic cushioning. Ottawa slashed GM's duty-free import quota by 24.2%, instantly exposing every U.S.-built GM vehicle entering Canada to a 25% tariff. For GM, that means a model costing $45,000 to produce now lands in Canada at roughly $56,000. Profit margins collapse, dealer inventories distort, customers walk away, and that's just the first wave. What makes this moment extraordinary is the speed at which the numbers begin to spiral. With the quota cut, GM faces potential losses between $600 million and $1.1 billion US per year if it insists on keeping production outside Canada. For dealers across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the sudden price spike and average increase of $11,000 per unit drops competitiveness by 16 to 20% overnight. Meanwhile, European competitors experience no change at all, strengthening their relative position inside Canada's $60 billion auto market. Detroit didn't expect this scenario. It didn't even model for it. And that's why this story is blowing up across the industry right now. The broader context matters. Ottawa had monitored GM since the first production suspension back in April. The company told workers it was temporary. It told the public operations would restart in May. But by the time May arrived, the production line capable of building 50,000 vehicles a year sat still. By July, the silence from Detroit was deafening. By September, household incomes in Ingersoll had already shrunk by more than 90 million Canadian dollars. EI claims across Oxford County jumped 38%. And the local economy was bleeding out sector by sector. So when GM made its permanent shutdown official on October 21st, Ottawa didn't improvise, it executed. And that's the part the world is now paying attention to. Because Canada didn't shout, it didn't threaten, it didn't summon ambassadors for dramatic optics. Instead, it flipped a policy switch that had been quietly built for this exact moment. The auto diminution framework. A mechanism designed not for retaliation, but for discipline. Break your commitments, lose your privileges immediately. That's why this confrontation feels different. It feels controlled, it feels calculated. It feels like a government using economic tools not as political symbolism, but as sovereign leverage. And when a G7 economy does that against one of the largest automakers in North America, people do not look away. And that is why you should not take your eyes off what happens next. This isn't just a dispute over one plant. It's the opening move of a much larger reshaping of how Canada defends its workers, its supply chains, and its industrial future. The numbers are real, the stakes are rising. And for the first time in years, the consequences are flowing back across the border, not the other way around. The pressure didn't erupt overnight. It built slowly, painfully, month after month, as the people of Ingersoll waited for a promise that kept drifting further out of reach. When GM first announced its temporary suspension back in April, workers held on because that's what they've always done. Weather the volatility, trust the next shift will come, trust that the company they serve for years wouldn't abandon them without warning. But the suspension stretched from 1 month to 2, then into 5, and by the time summer hit, the silence was louder than any official announcement. Inside the CAMI plant, a facility engineered to produce 50,000 electric delivery vans per year, the production line sat cold. The automation systems paid for with Canadian taxpayer investment remained idle. Employees with 10, 15, even 20 years of seniority waited beside phones that rarely rang. And in the town itself, the economic dominoes began to fall. The local suppliers that depended on the plant metal shops, logistics companies, fabrication crews saw contracts evaporate. By late June, Ingersoll was down an estimated 90 million Canadian dollars in household income. EI claims across Oxford County surged 38%. Small businesses reported revenue declines between 12 and 28%, depending on the sector. This wasn't just a factory slowdown, it was a slow bleed. And still, GM offered no clarity. Workers checked the internal portals daily. Union leaders made calls that went unanswered. Local officials reached out to GM headquarters in Detroit, only to receive vague assurances or no response at all. Families tried to stretch savings that were never meant to last this long. Mortgage deferrals increased. Credit card balances climbed. Every week, the question echoed louder. Was BrightDrop ever coming back? All the while, Ottawa watched. Not with panic, but with precision. Every economic indicator, every worker update, every deviation in GM's communications was monitored and logged. Because by that point, the government had already begun preparing for a scenario it hoped it wouldn't have to face: GM walking away completely. The turning point came in early September. Internally, federal analysts concluded that GM's production freeze was no longer a temporary pause, but a structural retreat. A retreat that violated the conditions of the over $1 billion invested by Ottawa and Ontario to convert Kami into the first large-scale EV plant in Canada. A retreat that destabilized Canada's broader clean tech strategy, one projected to anchor tens of thousands of future jobs. Behind closed doors in Ottawa, a quiet consensus formed. If GM abandoned its commitments, the response would not be symbolic. It would be systemic. But for the workers on the ground, all they saw was silence. Silence from Detroit. Silence from corporate leadership. Silence from the very company that had asked them to trust its long-term vision just 2 years earlier. And with each passing week, the cracks in daily life got deeper: grocery bills rising, local inflation pushing meal costs up nearly 9%, families choosing between gas and childcare, all while a billion-dollar facility sat dark on the edge of town. By the first week of October, anger began to replace uncertainty. How could a company that accepted billions in public funding simply step away from a community built around its presence for nearly 4 decades? How could a flagship EV plant meant to be a cornerstone of Canada's clean energy strategy become a ghost factory in less than 6 months? Then came October 21st. GM made it official. Not a delay, not a restructuring, a permanent shutdown. 1,200 workers terminated. BrightDrop discontinued at Kami. The future erased in a single corporate announcement. For Detroit, it was just another line on a quarterly adjustment. But for Ottawa, it triggered the contingency plan that had been months in the making. Because this time, Canada wasn't going to beg. It wasn't going to plead for investment. It wasn't going to wait for American goodwill. While the country absorbed the emotional fallout, federal officials moved with clinical focus, preparing the economic instruments that would soon flip the power dynamic entirely. And here's the part most viewers still don't realize. The sense of calm from Ottawa was the warning sign. When a government is quiet for that long, while a multinational disrupts thousands of lives, it's never inaction. It's preparation. And GM, fully confident that Canada would do what Canada had always done: absorb, adapt, move on, didn't see what was coming next. But you're about to. Because what happened after the shutdown wasn't just retaliation. It was the moment Canada stopped accepting the old rules and wrote its own. What happened next didn't come with speeches, warnings, or dramatic press conferences. It came in the form of a quiet, surgical action, one that hit Detroit harder than anything they had seen from Ottawa in decades. 3 days after GM confirmed the permanent shutdown, the Canadian government executed its counterstrike. No leaks, no hesitation. And no corporate lobbying effort was fast enough to stop what was already in motion. The first signal arrived in the inboxes of GM's legal and government relations teams at exactly 8:17 a.m. Eastern. A formal notice. Canada was activating the auto diminution framework, an economic pressure mechanism so new most executives had barely read its full policy language. Within minutes, internal chats at GM lit up. By 9 a.m., the company's legal group in Detroit had called an emergency meeting. That meeting lasted 14 hours. Because the consequences were immediate, GM's duty-free import quota into Canada, worth the equivalent of hundreds of millions of US dollars in preferential tariff exemptions, was slashed by 24.2%. Overnight, every US-made GM vehicle crossing the border would face a 25% tariff. No phase-in period. No grace window. No negotiation. For Stellantis, the blow was even harsher. A 50% reduction in tariff-free privileges after shifting Jeep production to Illinois. It was a message not just to GM, but to the entire North American auto architecture. If you take Canadian subsidies and walk away, Canada now has a button that turns your profits inside out. Inside Ottawa, the calculation was simple. GM broke $1 billion commitment, and Canada was no longer playing the role of the polite junior partner in the North American supply chain. Inside Detroit, the calculation was chaos. Tariff modeling teams scrambled to rerun their numbers. Analysts confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The new tariff regime could cost GM between $600 million and $1.1 billion per year if production remained outside Canada. Suddenly, shutting down CAMI was no longer a cost-saving move. It was a catastrophic financial miscalculation. Dealers across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania started panicking as well. A model that cost $45,000 to produce now landed at $56,000, pricing GM vehicles 16 to 20% above market competitors. Sales projections cratered. Inventory projections froze. Rival brands, especially European, gained a competitive advantage without lifting a finger. And all of this happened before noon. But the economic fallout wasn't even the part that shocked Detroit the most. What truly stunned executives was the cold, precise tone of the communications from Ottawa. No hedging, no diplomatic language, no bureaucratic softness. These weren't suggestions, they were ultimatums. Stellantis received a letter that could only be described as ruthless, a reminder of its legally binding commitments, the government's right to claw back public funding, and a clear statement that noncompliance would activate further penalties. GM received its own version shortly after. Then came the meeting request from Minister Melanie Joly, a meeting that wasn't optional. GM executives were told they had 15 days to present a viable, fully costed production plan for a new vehicle at CAMI. Not a broad outline, not a hopeful projection. A concrete plan with timelines, investments, and accountability metrics. For GM, it was a shock. For the auto industry, it was a precedent. For Canada, it was a declaration of sovereignty. Because the auto diminution framework wasn't designed as a weapon, it was designed as leverage. A structural lever that forces compliance through predictable consequences. Honor your commitments, and Canada remains a partner. Break them, and the tariff wall rises instantly. And it worked. Within hours of the tariff activation, internal reports at GM showed dealership pushback. Supply chain directors warned the company could run out of cross-border inventory within weeks. Finance teams delivered blunt assessments. If Ottawa kept the tariff active for even 8 months, reactivating CAMI would be cheaper than absorbing the penalties. But behind all the corporate panic, the real power shift was political. Canada wasn't just responding to a shutdown, it was rewriting the expectations of how multinational corporations treat Canadian workers. It wasn't retaliation, it was enforcement. It wasn't anger, it was policy. And that's why this moment is drawing global attention. Because GM expected negotiation and got discipline. They expected delay and got precision. They expected Canada to fold and instead saw a government that had spent months preparing for exactly this turn of events. This was the quiet counterstrike. And for GM, it wasn't the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of a new reality one, where Canada finally, firmly, controls the leverage it always had but never used. And the next move? That's where the game truly changes. The numbers started shifting faster than GM could process them, and that's when the real structural rupture began. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but inside the spreadsheets and risk models that determine corporate survival. Because the moment Canada flipped the tariff switch, every calculation GM relied on for its North American strategy became outdated. The old logic, centralized production in the US, import freely into Canada, rely on predictable access to a loyal market, collapsed in real time. It started with supply chain math. The tariff didn't just raise the price of a vehicle by $11,000. It destabilized GM's cross-border flow, a system that moves tens of thousands of units into Canada every quarter. With tariffs applied, the cost of sustaining that flow ballooned. Internal models showed GM's total cross-border operating costs could increase by $1.1 to $1.3 billion annually if the company attempted to maintain its existing supply lines without reactivating Canadian production. Then came the margin shock. Even after dealership adjustments and internal cost-cutting scenarios, GM analysts found their profit margins on several core models shrinking by 18 to 22%. Meanwhile, competing automakers, particularly European and Korean manufacturers, saw no change to their tariff exposure. Their vehicles stayed stable. GM's didn't. In the hyper-competitive Canadian market, that gap wasn't just damaging, it was devastating. But the real crisis wasn't just financial, it was strategic. For years, GM structured its North American operations around a set of assumptions. Canada would remain tariff neutral. Ottawa would prioritize stability over confrontation, and subsidies, once approved, would flow regardless of whether companies maintained their commitments. Those assumptions had held for decades. Now, every one of them was gone. Inside GM's strategy division, executives began recalculating scenarios. What if the tariff remained active for 12 months? What if it extended into 2026? What if Canada expanded the same framework to other EV categories? The worst-case scenario wasn't abstract anymore, it was quantifiable. And the more they ran the numbers, the more the conclusion became inescapable. Restarting CAMI might be the only financially viable path out. Meanwhile, dealerships across the U.S. border states were fighting their own battles. At least 60% of GM's Canadian-bound inventory originates from plants in Michigan, Missouri, and Tennessee. With a new tariff, dealers near the border reported price spikes that pushed GM's vehicles out of competitive brackets entirely. Customers who once compared GM against Ford or Toyota now jumped straight to competitors offering lower prices, shorter wait times, and zero tariff impact. One Ontario dealer told local media that GM models were becoming unsellable at current pricing, a phrase that set off alarms inside GM headquarters. And while the economics were shifting, the policy implications were even more profound. The auto diminution framework was designed to be predictable, something corporate planners hate at first but eventually must obey. Unlike the chaotic tariff waves under the Trump-era trade war, Canada's mechanism wasn't unstable. It didn't rise and fall with political moods. It followed rules. Invest in Canada, maintain production, protect Canadian jobs, or lose your privileges. That stability is what makes the framework so dangerous for companies that breach their commitments. You can fight chaos with chaos. You cannot fight structure. That's why supply chain directors inside GM began warning their executives that adapting to the new tariff was not a temporary fix. It required a structural redesign of the company's North American footprint. And redesigning a continental supply chain comes with a price tag far higher than reactivating a shuttered Canadian plant. By late November, analysts across the auto industry were publishing their own breakdowns. Several concluded that if GM attempted to absorb the tariff for more than 8 months, the cost equivalent would be the same as reopening CAMI at partial capacity. And by 14 months, GM would spend more on tariff penalties than it cost to modernize the plant in the first place. The numbers weren't just bad. They were unforgiving. And this is where the shift becomes historic. For decades, corporations held the leverage. Governments, especially Canada, were expected to accommodate, subsidize, and negotiate. The fear was always the same. Push too hard, and the company leaves. But by activating a fully designed, rule-based economic pressure system, Canada flipped the fear around. Now it was GM asking the question corporations never ask in this country: what if Canada doesn't back down? And beneath all the financial panic and policy rewrites, something deeper emerged, a sense that the North American auto landscape had entered a new era. For the first time, Canada wasn't reacting to US corporate decisions. It was shaping them. That's what makes this moment a structural shift, not a single policy action. The leverage isn't in the penalty, it's in the architecture that supports it. GM can negotiate against anger. It cannot negotiate against a policy system that makes non-compliance more expensive than cooperation. And that, more than the tariff itself, is what is now reshaping Detroit's long-term calculations. Because if Canada is willing to enforce these rules once, everyone knows it's willing to do it again. The fallout didn't take months. It didn't even take weeks. The shockwaves began rippling across the industry within days. And that's when the shift in Detroit's behavior became undeniable. What had started as corporate defiance was rapidly mutating into corporate retreat. And for the first time in years, the power dynamic between Canada and the US, auto giants flipped visibly, publicly, unmistakably. Ford was the first to blink. Analysts inside Ottawa noted an unusual development. Internal communications from Ford's North American leadership began circulating about a review of its planned 1.5 billion Canadian dollar expansion in Canada. The company didn't frame it as a threat, it framed it as a reassessment. A reconsideration triggered by the sudden realization that if GM could lose its privileges overnight, anyone could. And that subtle shift, the fear of structural enforcement rather than political symbolism, set off alarms inside the entire sector. Stellantis reacted next, and their move was even more dramatic. At the executive level, they removed their Canadian CEO, replacing him with a senior figure known internally for compliance stabilization. It wasn't just a leadership shakeup. It was a signal. Stellantis wasn't preparing to challenge Ottawa, they were repositioning to survive under the new rules. And that move reverberated across the industry because companies do not replace senior leadership in a G7 country unless they believe the ground under their feet has fundamentally changed. But the clearest indicator that the pressure was truly working, came from GM itself. Less than 3 weeks after the tariff activation, GM approached the Ontario government. Quietly, discreetly, off camera. A complete reversal from the cold distance it maintained for months. They didn't arrive with conditions or ultimatums. They arrived with questions. The same question echoed in every meeting: what must we do to make things right? For a company that spent decades assuming Canada would bend, not push, this was unprecedented. And while that political and corporate drama unfolded at the executive level, something even more revealing happened at the union level. Unifor, which had spent months fighting to protect workers from the fallout, suddenly found itself receiving calls not just from employees desperate for answers, but from corporate representatives asking for guidance. Not negotiating positions, guidance. What would workers accept? What timeline was realistic? What commitments would restore confidence? In a single stroke, the leverage shifted from boardrooms to bargaining tables. This hadn't happened in Canadian auto history for a generation. The financial models told the story even more starkly. Simulation teams across Detroit began calculating different outcomes. Tariff for 8 months, 12 months, 18 months. The results were brutal. By the 12-month mark, maintaining the status quo would cost GM more than reactivating CAMI at 50% capacity. By 18 months, the tariff penalties would exceed the cost of a full plant restoration. And by 24 months, GM would lose more money staying out of Canada than it saved by leaving. That is when the fear really took hold. Not fear of politics, but fear of math. Because while a company can argue with political rhetoric, it cannot argue with numbers that keep bleeding red. Inside media circles, several U.S. analysts attempted to frame Canada's move as overreach. But privately, auto economists were saying the opposite. Canada had discovered the pressure point. The system worked because it targeted the exact place where multinational corporations are weakest, the cost base of their supply chain. The tariff didn't create chaos. It created certainty. A certainty that leaving Canada now had a predictable, escalating price tag. And as that realization spread, boardrooms across the auto sector began to panic. Not because they feared retaliation, but because they feared precedent. If Canada had the power to enforce commitments this decisively, then the old playbook, take subsidies, shift production later, avoid consequences, was dead. You could feel the tone changing in every executive response. It was no longer, what is Canada doing? It was, what if we're next? This shift didn't just affect automakers. It triggered a broader reassessment across industries that received Canadian support: pharmaceutical companies, aerospace firms, battery manufacturers, tech multinationals. Companies that once dismissed Canada as low risk suddenly saw a government that didn't hesitate to enforce its rules. But perhaps the most telling transformation happened among the workers themselves. After months of silence, abandonment, and uncertainty, they watched the largest automakers in North America pivot, not because of public pressure, but because the government held its line. For the first time, workers saw that Canada wasn't just defending them in theory. It was defending them in practice, with policy, with consequence, with calculation. And that is the moment the balance of power snapped into a new configuration. GM's calls, Stellantis' reshuffling, Ford's reassessment, these were not signs of stability. They were signs of surrender. Quiet, reluctant, strategic surrender, because Detroit finally understood that this was not the old Canada. Not the Canada that absorbed corporate decisions. Not the Canada that tolerated broken promises. This was a Canada that acted. And the next step, what happens when GM finally sits down with the government and faces the 15-day ultimatum, that's where everything will shift again. Because now, the question isn't who holds the leverage. It's how far Canada is willing to go to use it. Economic War Canada narrator Danoy, GM's 15-day deadline didn't just mark the countdown to a corporate decision, it marked the beginning of a new era in how Canada defines its economic sovereignty. And as the clock ticked, the stakes grew sharper on every front. This wasn't simply about reactivating a shuttered plant. It wasn't about a single community. It wasn't even about GM alone. It was about the signal Canada was sending across the global economy. The era of taking Canadian subsidies, Canadian markets, and Canadian workers for granted is over. Inside Ottawa, officials weren't treating the deadline as a negotiation point, they were treating it as policy execution. If GM delivered a credible plan for CAMI, tariffs could be rolled back with precision. If GM stalled or attempted to dilute its commitments, the tariff wall would remain up indefinitely. And because the auto diminution framework operates on strict rules, not political mood, GM's executives had no space to play for time. They had to produce numbers. They had to produce a model. They had to produce proof. Across the industry, companies quietly started reassessing their long-term maps. If Canada was willing to enforce consequences on one of North America's largest automakers, there was no scenario where other multinational recipients of Canadian support could assume immunity. Aerospace firms, battery manufacturers, pharmaceutical giants, tech supply chain players. Every sector with operations north of the border began rereading their Canadian agreements, this time with a level of scrutiny they had never applied before. That scrutiny tells you everything about how the ground has shifted. For decades, Canada was viewed as predictable to the point of passivity, stable, friendly, cooperative, and unlikely to escalate conflict with foreign corporations. But the Ingersoll showdown broke that image in half. The tariff wasn't improvisation, it was infrastructure. And by using it once, Canada proved to the global market that it would use it again, whenever necessary. This is why GM's return to negotiations wasn't framed as partnership, it was framed as compliance. The company wasn't arriving from a position of authority, it was arriving from a position of consequence. And underneath that high-level drama lies the reason this moment feels transformative. The workers. For the first time in years, Canadian workers saw their government enforce the rules with the same strength. Corporations enforced theirs. They saw a system that, rather than bending under pressure, pushed back. Hard, predictably, strategically. A single mother who worked 12 years at CAMI now sees the same boardrooms that ignored her concerns scrambling to respond to her government's demands. A community that watched its future collapse in a matter of months now watches Detroit rethink its entire North American structure because Ottawa said enough. And every worker across the country from Windsor to Oshawa to Oakville to Lethbridge now has evidence, not promises, that Canada has tools and isn't afraid to use them. That's the real shift. Not tariffs, no quotas, not the 15-day ultimatum, but the confidence that Canada is no longer the quiet observer in its own economic story. And as this chapter reaches its turning point, one question rises above the rest. When Canada finally presents its new industrial rules to the world, rules grounded in sovereignty, discipline, and long-game strategy, who will adapt and who will be forced to rethink their place in this country? Because the next move will determine more than GM's future. It will shape the next decade of Canada's industrial identity.